So this is Greg Salmieri. He's a philosophy fellow at the Anthem Foundation. He's the co-secretary of the Ayn Rand Society, which is a professional group affiliated with the American Philosophical Association. He teaches at Rutgers University. He also does teaching and other work for the Ayn Rand Institute, and he's an advisor to Strive. So he has his fingerprints all over this conference and all over objectivism. He's also the co-editor of the book A Companion to Ayn Rand in the prestigious Blackwell Companions to Philosophy series, which is kind of a landmark of Ayn Rand scholarship. And with that, he's going to be speaking on, his title is Taking Responsibility for Your Happiness, Insights from Ayn Rand's Ethics. So let's welcome Greg Salmieri.
We'll get to the significance of the song in a minute. So the title of this talk, as Keith said, is Taking Responsibility for Your Happiness, Insight from Ayn Rand's Ethics. And I'll come to the topic of happiness in due course. For now, let me come at what I'm going to talk about today in a different way. Ankar Gate this morning talked about taking the reins of your mind. And you can think of this session as about taking the reins of your life. Look, we always hear about the ways in which our lives are deeply affected by forces outside ourselves. Yaron Brook, in the opening lecture last night, quoted President Obama and Elizabeth Warren's reasons for thinking you didn't build that for whatever that is, whether it's your business or yourself. And there are a lot of them. There are teachers and genes and roads, and a lot of them they don't even mention, ways in which we're all very lucky to have born in the 20th or 21st century rather than the 5th or the 4th. Or rather than in Somalia. There are lots of things we don't control, lots of things that are outside of our control that affect us and can have really big effects on us. But not everything is like that. Not everything is like that. There are things that are within our control, and we can think of the things that aren't within our control as falling into two categories, sort of innate endowments and circumstances. And I think we don't really know much about what endowments are innate, because everything, every trait that we know about that anybody has that's expressed in their life is a combination of whatever innate capacities they had and whatever circumstances acted on them, and for many of them, the choices they made. But surely there's some innate capacities. Yaron's probably right that no matter what happened to him, he couldn't have played as well as LeBron James or Michael Jordan, and no matter what he chose. So there must be some innate. But people think they know a lot more about it than they do. But whatever there is innate and whatever circumstances impact us, and of course they do, that's not all there is to life. There's more to life. There's our ability to make choices. And I think the way we can think about it is all this other stuff, whatever innate genes we have and abilities we have, and whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, these are things that happen to us. And we want to contrast them to things that we do, things that we make, things that we build. We as human beings are not things that things just happen to. We're doers. We're not nexes of millions of accidents. Whatever accidents happen around us, whatever coincidences, whatever happens to us, there's then what we do about it. If you think of your life or yourself as a building, whatever innate endowments you might have would be the raw materials out of which it's built. And whatever circumstances you're in, which were infected by other people in lots of ways, would be the environment, the site on which the building's built. But buildings aren't just materials on sites. Materials on a site is a pile of bricks and wood, or of beams and concrete. A building's got something else. It has somebody make it, organize it, order it, come up with the idea for it, direct people to put it together. And your choice is that factor in your life. You're the one who builds your life, who builds your character. If we have free will, if we have control over our minds in the way Dr. Gate discussed, and in the way I think we do and can tell that we do, and I'll be assuming that we do in this talk, then whatever circumstances there are, And the circumstances can affect us tremendously. And whatever innate characteristics we have, and they can affect us tremendously. The real question is, whatever you find yourself in, whatever situation you're in, what are you going to do about it? Because nobody else is going to do it for you. What are you going to make of your life? Is it going to be a pile of unconnected crap, like the bricks and boards of wood if no one did anything about it and they just got blown together by the wind or dumped up wherever they did by the people who delivered them? Or are you going to make something of them? Because you've got one life. You have, as Rourke says at the beginning of The Fountainhead, maybe 60, maybe for some of you 70 now, more years to live. What are you going to do with those years? What do you want your life to be about? Because if you're able to think and to control your thinking and to make decisions and to think about things differently than you have and consider new things, then this is up to you. And you're going to ruin or waste your life, or you're going to make something of it that you're proud of and happy of. A lot of people just move through life like they're on some kind of a script, like everything's preset, pretending they don't have choices or not acknowledging the ones they do, not acknowledging what it takes to make a choice. And that's what the song I had them play is about. 2 points to that. I was sitting here in the back thinking, well, it's interesting that we have house music at these things now, but the songs feel kind of random, like they're whatever popular. I wonder if we can kind of thematize it somewhat or make it kind of fit with the theme of the conference, or maybe different speakers. And then I thought, I could do something about that. I could say, before I come on, can you play a song? Here are a couple of songs about free will. It's a very little change, but you can do that in all kinds of places in your life, and you can do it to the course of your life as a whole. And that's what that song, which is from the musical version of Matilda, is about. It's a song about people who find themselves in stories. For people on the live video feed who can hear it, the song is the song Naughty from the musical Matilda. It's about characters in stories who find themselves in a situation on a script, having to go through a certain situation that they don't think is right, that's not what they want. And they change their story. Or why don't they change their story, asks the title character. She's going to change hers. Well, there's no story written for you, none that you have to follow. If you're in charge of your life, if you're not just a place where things happen, but a person who does things, who thinks and can decide things, then your life can be what you want to make it. If you take up the reins of your life. Otherwise, it's not really your life anyway. It's just a mess. In this context, I want to talk about Ayn Rand's ethics. There are two essays that are kind of in the back of my mind as I'm talking about this. One of them is her essay, The Objectivist Ethics, that recaps a lot of the themes in Atlas Shrugged. And I'll talk a little bit about some ideas from that essay later. The other one that's sort of more at the top of my mind is called Causality versus Duty. And in that essay, she quotes an old Spanish proverb that she likes. The proverb says, God said, take what you want and pay for it. Take what you want and pay for it. What's the significance of this proverb? Well, God's a metaphor for maybe morality, or for maybe reality, for what's beyond our power, for what we can't change, and for what we maybe have to do. She didn't believe in God, but she's using, whoever wrote this proverb probably did, and she's using it as a metaphor. But what is God, what does he say? He says, take what you want and pay for it. So what does take what you want mean? You might think of God, right, as giving you a whole list of orders. Thou shalt not do this, and thou shalt do that, and, bow down before me on a rug a couple of times a day, or don't eat this for this month, or whatever other crap people think God tells them that they should live their lives by. Or even be in love with this kind of person at this kind of time, and have this kind of relationship, and this kind of families, and be sure that you give money back to these people, or whatever rules people think that God, or whatever they put in place of God, has for them. Whatever imposed constraints, whatever obligations they think they're under, whatever duties they think they're under, where a duty is understood as something you've just got to do, but not because of anything you chose. But God, as envisioned in this proverb, says, no, none of that. I'm not telling you what to do with your life, what goals to have, who or what to love or what to spend your time or any of that. I'm not into this, none of that. Or glorify me or any of this stuff. None of that. I'm not telling you what to do and what not to do. I'm saying take what you want. Here's a world, here's a reality out there for you. Decide on something, go for it. And pay for it. And we'll get to what the pay for it means, because you have to be realistic. You have to think about what it requires. You have to do what's needed to be done to get the things that you want. What I think the proverb brings out, the perspective it brings out, is a perspective that, if you really grasp free will, you just see is right, which is that all these kinds of constraints on us, anything that you think you just have to do, because that's just how it's done, that's just what's expected, that's just how it's supposed to be, anything like that is BS. And it's more than BS. It's a crutch to avoid facing the fact that you have responsibility, that you have a choice, that you can make something of your life, that you can make it what you want, and that you're responsible for how it turns out. You can't control everything, but you can control a lot. And you're responsible to yourself, for what happens. If your life's not how you want it to be, well, that's largely on you. I'm going to quote a philosopher I don't much like, and I don't quote often, but I think he has one phrase that I think is really fantastic, and that's the French philosopher Sartre. One reason I don't quote him often is I can't pronounce French, and I say that name wrong. But Jean-Paul Sartre, and he has a phrase, bad faith. And what he means by bad faith is acting as though you have to act this way when you have a choice. You're playing some kind of role. You're doing what it's thought you would do, as though you were an inanimate object that automatically went through certain motions. And he thinks a lot of people do this. They play the role of the waiter. They have the job of a waiter, and they act the perfect part of a waiter rather than acting like themselves being a waiter and recognizing that they've chosen to be here. The waiter example is a bit small and silly, but I think we do this a lot in our lives. We have roles, we learn, we notice how people act, and we emulate it. There are certain expectations that other people have, and we just kind of fit into them. And they stand to us like things we have to do, as though they're commandments from God or from reality, and you just have to act this way. You do have to take reality into account, but I'm going to talk about that, and there's a lot to say about how you should act. But nothing like this. It doesn't give you a role to play. And if you act as though it does, part of it might be that you haven't thought through the issue deeply enough, but a large part of it is probably fear of recognizing what it means that you really can control things. These things are crutches. They're crutches for not actually doing the work of making up your mind about what you want your life to be. I gave you this building metaphor earlier. If you don't do anything, you just end up with a pile of bricks and stones. There's another version of the metaphor for people who've read The Fountainhead. Think of the character of Peter Keating, or almost any of the architects in that novel other than Howard Rourke. How do they build? Well, they do build. They don't just lift the building materials on the ground. But they just build the way that other people built before them, with tiny minor variants, just copying things out of their library. So they do make a choice, because they have choice and they can't avoid it, but they don't make the choice to come up with, to build something they like or to think about what they like and then figure out how to pay for it, how to make it real, what can be done with it. Instead, they just kind of ape and go through the motions that they've seen gone through before. And most people waste their lives like that. But you don't have to. To really want something, take what you want and pay for it. To really want something, says Peter, is hard, he realizes at the end of the novel, after he's destroyed his life by not doing it. You're young. You don't have to find yourself there. What these things are, what Peter Keating does, what Sartre calls bad faith, is a failure of what Rand calls independence. And I'll get back to the topic of independence later. But it's a moral virtue. Because things are in our control, there are facts that we can recognize that enable us to take control and to make the most of our lives. And those facts are what she calls moral virtues, or rather are recognitions of those facts. And what Peter Keating isn't doing, and what the people Sartre calls exhibiting bad faith aren't doing, or what the people who get into a certain kind of relationship because their parents expect it of them, or take a certain kind of job because everybody expects it of them, or do whatever else because it's just what you do, are not being independent. They're not living lives of their own. They're just following a script. They're not realizing that they have a choice, that there's nothing they gotta do, and that they can take what they want and pay for it. And what does the pay for it part mean? Well, whatever you choose, there will be something you have to do to get it. Moreover, it will have consequences on your circumstances, abilities, times, other projects, other things you can choose going forward. And you better keep aware of this when you make your choice. Otherwise, you're going to be foreclosing other things that are open to you, things that you might have preferred. You have to not evade, not put things out of your mind, the consequences of your actions or what's required for your goals, if you really want those goals. But rather, you have to actively think about what's needed to achieve them. How do they fit with these other things I'm considering choosing? How can I put them together into something that's coherent that I can work to achieve, rather than chasing a little bit of this now and a little bit of this then, and they never add up to anything. Not all choices are compatible. Take what you want and pay for it. Taking some things precludes you from taking others. The payment is that you can't have them. Taking your cake, or eating it, precludes your having it too. Put a little bit more technically, you can't get away with contradictions. Contradictions between your goals, that is, if you're pursuing two opposite things, you're not going to achieve both of them and probably not going to achieve either of them. You can't achieve contradictions between your goals and your nature, that is, things that are impossible to you, like having a goal to be 7 foot tall when you're not, or to be able to fly. And contradictions between your means and your ends, like trying to achieve by pandering to people the end of serving your own values, which is what Gail Winan tries to achieve. Or to be political, the end of making America great by voting for a barbarian who doesn't care about America or have any values. But getting back to decent people and what we want to do with our lives and real builders, taking what you want and paying for it involves coming up with a life that you want for yourself, figuring out what a life for me would be, what life I want, and having as part of that life that I figure out how I'm going to get there from here. Because a life is a process of action. It's a process of achieving things, of making things, of building things for yourself. And a bunch of vain dreams that you have no idea how to get to, that you have no idea what the price is and no idea how you would come up with that price and no idea how to pay for it, how to do it, is not a life. It's just a fantasy. It's a delusion. And it's like the commandments from God, a crutch to escape the fact that you have choices. Oh, I wish I was taller, and I wish I was this, and I wish I was that, and I wish I could fly, and so forth. Well, you're not trying to build an airplane, but just, wishing things were other. Or I wish I lived during the Renaissance rather than now. I'm not going to try to make the culture more like the Renaissance, but I'm just going to wish it, right? That is not reality-oriented thinking. That's not really taking what you want and paying for it. It's not really valuing, to use that word. It's just daydreaming and wasting your life away. This brings me to the concept of happiness. Rand defines happiness as a state of, or she describes it as a state of non-contradictory joy. Sometimes we use happiness to mean just a feeling you might have in a moment, and any kind of positive feeling will count. And I guess you can use the word that way. Pleasure, I think, is a better word for that. But what we often mean by happiness, and what she means by it, is a state of non-contradictory joy. And the non-contradictory is important. There are a lot of things that are pleasant, or, well, sort of pleasant, or at least take away some of our anxiety in the moment. But that can't give us any kind of non-contradictory joy, because we know that by achieving them, we're frustrating our ability to achieve others, and they don't last. So that any fleeting feeling of joy you have in them is tinged with pain and guilt and fear. But a non-contradictory joy is an enjoyment you can take in particular things and in your life as a whole, where the enjoyment pervades the whole of life, because you know that each good thing that you're taking pleasure in fits with, it enhances, augments, works together with all the other things that you want and care about. There are no hangovers. There are no tensions. It's non-contradictory. It fits together. But such non-contradictory joy requires having values, consistent, rational values, which means goals that are consistent with one another and consistent with all the relevant facts about human nature, about your specific nature, about your circumstances, about the effects that these goals will have if they're accomplished down the line, about what kind of means you would need to enact to obtain them, and that therefore cohere into a life that you yourself can enact. The happiness that you get by having such a set of values and then acting on them is non-contradictory joy. Rand describes it as that state of consciousness that proceeds from the achievement of one's values. And it requires, again, that they be your values, that you not take the things you're working towards as what people go after or what you have to go after as a good American or good Christian or good Muslim or good Midwesterner or good whatever you're from, or good objectivist for that matter, who has to like skyscrapers or something. But it's rather things that you chose, that you thought about how they fit together and form a self-sustaining, achievable to you whole. Self-sustaining is important, and we'll talk more about that later. But they form a whole such that you can act for them, you can expect to achieve them, or at least make some progress towards them, which would count as a real achievement, and that progress wouldn't be self-undermining, but is rather something that will feed itself and can continue. It's what it is to have consistent goals. This brings me to something Rand said about purpose, which she regards as one of the cardinal values in a human life. She describes purpose as your choice of the happiness that your mind will proceed to achieve. Your choice of the happiness that your mind will proceed to achieve, that your mind must achieve. You're choosing happiness. And there are 2 points here. The first is that you have to choose to be happy. Not like in the moment you can just switch it on, but you have to choose that as something that's important to you. Let me put it another way, more rudely. You have to choose to give a shit about your life. A lot of people don't. If you've read Atlas Shrugged, think of Cheryl Taggart's family, that she escapes and comes down to the city and gets a job at the 5 and 10. They were poor, and they didn't care. It's not that they were poor, there's no shame in that, but they were just stagnating in that position. They weren't doing anything to try to get out of it. If they tried and failed, that would be one thing, but they were just not going to change their story. They were going to leave it as it is. And a lot of people are like that. They're not thinking about what they can do to make something of their lives for themselves. They're just letting it go. They're not choosing to be happy. That is, they're not taking their lives and the fact that they're their lives and they're in their control seriously. They're not owning it. They're just acting as though life is something that just happens to them. But it's not. Or it doesn't have to be. Purpose is your choice of the happiness that you're going to pursue with your reason. And the first point under that point is that you have to choose to be happy, to care about what becomes of you. But you also have to choose your specific happiness, that is, come up with it. It's not that you just choose happiness, but you choose something for your life to be about that's going to be your happiness. So for example, to go back to the fountainhead, which I've been using as a running example, Howard Rourke's life is Howard Rourke Architect. It's summed up by the slogan on his door, right? That's what he chose. Those words mean something to him. It's not just the words, but it's like a kind of conception of what his life can be like, what his career is. He didn't just choose, I want to be happy now, whatever. He picked a particular thing, which is what life is for him, and he achieves it. What's your thing? You might not have one yet, you're young, but it should be a question. Something that you're thinking about. What am I going to do with my life? What do I want my life to be about? Maybe it won't be one career that's the same one for your whole life, but what is the theme of my life? What do I want my life to add up to? Don't feel bad if you don't have an answer, but don't feel too good either. I mean, don't feel guilty if you don't have an answer, but don't feel like, no one knows, you can't tell what's going to happen, I'll just, smoke a joint and hang out with my friends or whatever. That's wasting your life. Think about how to get where you want to go and how to get there. And if you don't know, think about that you don't know, and think about, well, how do I figure it out? You choose what your happiness is going to consist in by choosing values, by choosing what your goals are. Gina's going to talk a little bit tomorrow about how the psychological mechanics of how one can do this. But in broad outline, what I think you do is you conceive of a life for yourself, and you then try to achieve that life. And it's two steps. It's conceiving of a life for yourself and achieving that life. Like if you were going to design a building, you don't just stare at the pile of bricks and wait for them to assemble themselves, or stare at some other dude's building and try to copy it. You think like, what's my idea for this? Given all the inputs that go into it, given the options that I have, given the materials I have that I can build out of, given the constraints of the site and whatever else is relevant, what idea do I have that I could realize with these things that would be worthwhile, that I would value, that I would like? And then how, once I've come up with that, can I assemble these things step by step, do whatever I need to do to make that thing real? So it's conceiving of something, a goal, and then trying to achieve that, and then achieving that goal. Well, what ethics is a guide to doing that in a very abstract way. There's a lot more you need to know to do it. You need to know a lot about your personal situation and what talents you have, and you might need to know some psychological skills to help you do it, or management skills. But at the most abstract level, ethics is about how to live that kind of a life, how to come up with and then achieve that kind of a life. And one wants to think of ethics, or at least Rand thinks of ethics, and I think she's right. I think we should think of ethics. I think if you really take seriously the fact that you have free will and follow out all the implications of it, you will think of ethics not as a set of constraints that come from God knows where. Do this, don't do that, kill your kid out of obedience to me, or whatever it is. Not as a set of constraints or demands, but as knowledge of how to create a human life. Because part of paying for it, and part of rationally coming up with something to want, is taking into account all the facts of reality about what kind of creature you are, what kind of needs you have, what will happen to you if you pursue certain courses, what kinds of things are achievable for you in the short run and the long run, what kind of goals will further each other and kind of form a synergy, what kind of goals and projects will form a synergy and which ones will pull apart. What kinds of actions are needed to achieve those kinds of goals, and what actions will frustrate them. And what ethics is a kind of body of knowledge about how human beings do that. What is it about human beings that makes certain kinds of values achievable for them, and other kinds of things that you might talk about but can't really be values because there's no way to act towards them. What makes certain types of activity or ways of functioning necessary components of any human life that's going to achieve any values, because it's part of how we achieve values, and what will necessarily frustrate any human life. I've spent a lot of time kind of now building up ethics and trying to motivate you. I'm only going to say a little bit, though, about the content of ethics, the content of Rand's ethics, because a lot of it's been implicit in what I've already said, and because I want to leave a lot of time for questions, and I tend not to. So what are the contents of ethics? Well, first, I'm not going to give you any arguments for these other than what's implicit in what I've already said. If we really have this take what you want and pay for it perspective, if we really have this perspective, there's nothing we just have to do, but there's a whole world out there, and we can choose what we want out of our lives in that world. But we have to, in choosing it, know that there are only certain kinds of things we'll be able to achieve, that for whatever we're trying to achieve, there are going to be certain ways that we're going to have to act in order to get it, otherwise we won't get anything at all. The fundamental value, if you're thinking that way, if you're thinking, here I am with a world and what do I want out of it, is that you have to value yourself, your life, yourself, as the fundamental value. Because whatever things you value, you recognize as coming from your own choice. There's no authority to impose the values on you. Anything you're going after, anything that your life's about, it's ultimately about because you chose it. And if you don't think that, maybe you're confused. But I think fundamentally, if you don't think that, at some level, you're bullshitting yourself. You know you could be doing otherwise. You can tell. And if you really know that, and you really know when you're going after something, that at some level this is because I chose it, or I chose something that this is part of, then you recognize yourself as the source of your values. Yourself as the one who chooses them, the one who achieves them, and in that sense, the one who, therefore, they're parts of your life, any individual thing that you're after. And you're after it as part of your life, as something selected by you to be achieved by you. And that means whatever it is that's going to make up your life, whatever particular things you want to fill your days with, and spend those days going after, so that those things will fill those days and help them to continue. The kind of heading under which all that falls, whatever you're pursuing, is in some way or other your particular life. What life is for you, whether that's being an architect like Howard Rourke of a certain sort, or a teacher of a certain sort, or a web developer, or whatever it turns out to be. And if your life is going to be your fundamental, your ultimate value, the thing that's standing behind anything, if your life is what's at stake, really, in everything you do, what you either give a shit about or don't, then what do you need to be like to value your life? What other things, no matter what particular values your life's going to consist in and going to be filled with, what kinds of values do you have to have in order to have a life at all, to have a human life at all? Because you are a human being and you can't achieve a frog's life or a pig's. Well, the fundamental one is your mind. It's your mind that chooses. It's your mind that identifies facts. It's your ability to think that's fundamental to your ability to do everything else. So you have to value your reason. And what does valuing your reason mean? It means caring about it, nurturing it, developing it. It means caring about what's true. It means when someone says something and there's no evidence for it, being offended by that. It means when there's a proliferation of news sites on one or the other side of the political spectrum that aren't news but conspiracy theories, and as you start looking at them, you can tell there's no reason to think it. And it's just kind of not helping you get to know the world better. It means saying, I want to know what's true. I don't care what favors my side or the other side or helps me smack down the other. I want to know what's true. How do I tell what's true? And it means doing that in every area of life. It means putting it is above I wish, whatever that I wish might be. Because you know that if you really wish it, if you wish it in a reasonable way, rather than just as a way to avoid facing truth, that you need to know what's real in order to get it, in order to know how it fits with other things. There are other virtues. It means having integrity, acting on your judgments, because you're only cheating yourself if you're not. Honesty, which we can talk about in the question period. Justice. And all these go under the heading of valuing your mind, and therefore practicing rationality, the virtue of recognizing that you need to run your mind, that you need to be in focus, that you need to choose to think, that the world's really out there, and your acting otherwise won't change it. The second key value that you have to have any kind of life, to pursue any kind of life, to achieve any kind of happiness, is purpose. You have to recognize that your direction in life is not something automatic that comes over you or that you have to just obey, but something that you have to generate and sustain. And you have to care about generating and sustaining it. And what that means in practice is the virtue of what Rand calls productiveness. It's recognizing that if you've chosen a purpose, whatever that purpose might be, you can choose another one, but whatever it is, you've chosen it. And what it is for it to be your purpose is for you to actually be acting to bring it about in reality, not just for you to prattle on about how cool it is, to impress your friends or rationalize not doing anything else. You have to pay for it if it's really your purpose. You've chosen it. Do you keep choosing it? Well, then act for it. Whatever you want, if you really want it, if it's not just words, if you're not just going to let life pass you by, you have to be working to bring it into reality. You have to accept that there's no one who's going to do it for you. There can't be, by nature, anyone who's going to realize your values that you've come up with for you. And since life is about values, life is about what you choose and go after, you need some kind of career, some kind of active value pursuit over time to be the centerpiece of your life. Otherwise, there's a contradiction in your life. Otherwise, you're saying, what I really want is X. That's what I want my life to be about, but it's not what I do with my life. There was a great article in The Onion, the satirical newspaper, some time ago that said, find the thing you love and that really makes you happy, and then do it on nights and weekends for the rest of your life. But that's not a life worth living. Now, I mean, hobbies are great. I've got 3 of them, 2 of them really, besides my main work, and I do them a lot on nights and weekends. And I'm not saying, but that's not what I chose. I didn't want to be a guitar player as the center of my life, or a chef, which are my 2 main hobbies. I wanted to be a philosopher, and that's what I do. And I've tried to organize my life around that. And it could change. But whatever it is that you want to be your life, find a way to make it your life. And then the third crucial value that any human life requires, that achieving your happiness requires, that you need to be part of what you want if you're going to be able to pay for what you want, is self-esteem. And self-esteem is the conviction that you're able to live and worthy of living, because your mind is competent to figure out what's true, to direct your life, to act on it. That's something that you need to sustain this kind of purposeful action over time. If you're always thinking, I can't do it, then you're not going to be able to do it. And likewise, if you're always thinking, little old me, I'm not worthy of it. It would really make my mother unhappy if I did this. And who am I to do that? What does my happiness matter? That example resonates with me. I've been reading a blog occasionally, Ex-Muslim Girl, I think it's called. It's about a British woman who grew up in a Muslim family and she became an atheist. And for some time she didn't tell her parents. And eventually she didn't. And I should say I have several ex-Muslim friends who get along fine with their parents. So don't think this is necessarily your fate if you change your religion. But they reacted horribly. She lost all of her relationship, and it's just been a real trial for her. But that takes real self-esteem. And her brothers are saying, why are you so selfish? Couldn't you just, keep quiet about it and make mom happy? That's someone who's taking what she wants and paying for it. She wants a life of her own. She wants a life of not faking and hiding and pretending to believe things she doesn't and being someone who she isn't. But to do that requires real strength. And it requires knowing that I can do it. I can make it on my own. I can stand up to these people. And that it's worth it. My life is worth it. I'm worth it. And so you need that to be part of what you value about your life. Your self-esteem, your self-respect, your self-love. And how do you achieve that? Through the virtue of what Rand calls purpose, or moral ambitiousness. Through always going a little bit farther. Whenever you notice yourself letting yourself slide on something, pushing for that extra clarity, pushing to be a little bit better. Not by beating yourself up, but by being demanding of yourself. On this premise that it's what you want, and you're not going to settle for less than what you can be. Well, these are the things I think we can learn from Ayn Rand, are parts of what a human life looks like, are parts of what we can achieve, are necessary for anything we might want to achieve. And I think if you hold them in mind and think about them, they can help you to conceive of a life for yourself and to achieve it. But it's up to you. Well, you know what? They'll get the mic on, but why don't, instead of wasting time, you tell me and...
Actually, speaking of time, I wanted to ask about a longer time frame than the present. So across species, I want to know what you think about a value system. So does a primate have a value system? Does a squirrel? Does a tree? And then also, across time, humans evolved. So if we all started from one cell, at what point did values come into existence?
So the question is, what about other animals? Do they have values too? And since we seem to have evolved from earlier animals, where in the point, if they didn't have values, where in the chain do those values come online? I think they do and they don't in different senses of the term. There are things that are in common among all living things, and then there are, I think, really big differences at different points along the spectrum of life. So I think all living things have things that they go after and that they need to achieve in order to keep on being living things. And I think the lives of every species the life of every organism is structured around some such set of things, and which set of things it is varies from species to species. So what a dog goes after and will need are the things that make up and sustain the dog way of life, and likewise for a fungus and so forth, and they're different from each one to the next. What's different is that some creatures do some of that work consciously, like animals that chase after things, and some do it all non-consciously, just through genetic programming, like a plant does, and like most of what an animal does, right? Because animals don't really consciously direct their lives. Like, an animal will run after something to eat or someone to sleep with, but it doesn't consciously decide about what kind of nutrition it needs or like do family planning, right? It doesn't know it's going to get pregnant or sire children, right? It just, that one smells nice and they're running, right? So human beings, animals have a bit of consciousness that guides them in very short-range purposes. Human beings have the whole process under our conscious control. And we don't control like the mitochondria and what they're doing, but the essential direction of our lives is under our control. And therefore, our whole code of values is under our control in a way that isn't the case for any other living thing. And sometimes I think we use the word value only to mean the kind of conscious chosen values that are distinctive to human beings. Sometimes we use it in a wider sense in which it'll apply to all animals. Now, what about the fact that if the earlier ones don't have some things we do, what point in evolution did we get them? And I say, I don't know, we have to go, and that's an issue of biology to figure out which species have which abilities. But if the significance of the question is if there's some kind of continuum to life, then there couldn't be something new in some of the species that wasn't there in their ancestor species that's really radically different. I think that's not true. I mean, some things can fly and some things can't. And then there are some things that can kind of half-ass fly or glide or, get a little bit of, but at a certain point in the evolution of flying, and flying evolved several times, right, in different taxa of animals, and there were some things that could get off the ground a little bit, and it was like a cool little adjunct to their way of life of basically doing other things. But at some point, the wings got good enough that the thing could really fly. And from that point on, a new life system evolved in those things, where all the other things in their life started evolving around a flying lifestyle, right? So birds, at least flying birds, have a flying, and they have the kind of beaks and claws they do because they have a life that's kind of centered around locomotion by flying. And likewise, human beings have a kind of life that's centered around selection of purposes by reason and thinking by reason. And probably there was some, being in the distant past that can sort of think a little bit, but not really, and not enough to make its life go around it, but could, get out of a bind, touched by it or something. And it would be interesting to find out about that when we know more about our ancestors and when we know more about the physiological roots of our kinds of consciousness, which we might discover at some point. And then we could look at the skulls of whatever, or the DNA fragments we have of earlier people and say, oh, they had this brain part and that seems to be involved, and then we could try to figure it out. But I don't think we know enough about how the physiology of it works even in us to be speculating about things that we only know about by their bones.
Okay, and I know we're sick of follow-ups, just a really quick one. So then what do you think 10,000 years or 1,000,000 years down the road, is this current philosophy of ethics eternal, or would we look back at our current selves and say,
some things
whatever
are eternal, things that are eternal for human beings, things that are true of human beings by their nature, are going to be true of human beings wherever and whenever there are human beings. But if some other creature evolves that's not a human being anymore, then something else might be true the same things will be true, but something else might be the way it needs to live. And maybe some of those things that aren't human beings will be some of our descendants.
Thank you.
But they're not human beings, so the ethics doesn't change. It's just, if some wasp-like thing is your great-great-grandkid, then God knows what's good for it. Oh, let's do the toggling sides. Yeah, Tyler.
What is your perspective on the supposed paradox of conflicting values, in that, if you choose values, how does a thinking, willful person arrive at this conflict? And
So
if there is free
the
will,
supposed conflict between conflicting values. Can you give me an example of the conflict you have in mind?
just say falling in love with a person, but that person is harmful towards your life. And so you have this conflict of wanting to live happily, but you still love this person. So
Well, I
how does a
think
person arrive at this conflict of values, and how does one use free will to resolve this?
Well, I think we need two kinds of examples. So one kind of example is you have strong feelings for someone and they're really bad for you. But what it means for them really to be bad for you is that what you want out of this feeling you have for this person, you can't get. There's no kind of life that you can have that incorporates other things you value and her, and the valuing of her is going to be self-undermining in some way. If that's the case, then you have to start thinking about why you want this person. It doesn't make sense. It's not going to fit in with the rest of what you want. And you might need some therapy or just some hard time thinking about why you're making these destructive choices. But let's take another kind of case where it's not like you want to be with an abusive partner who hates you and bleeds you black and blue and doesn't have any redeeming qualities, and it's because you don't have self-esteem or you're repeating some cycle of violence. It's not a case like that where the answer is, no, you can't. This is destroying an essential thing you need for life. You've got to get away from this, woman. But take a case where, you want to be with someone whose career, it's crucial to her that she be in a certain city, but you want a different career, it's crucial to you that you be in another place, and neither of them is remunerative enough that you can travel to see each other. Where there are a couple of things that are reasonable values, but they don't fit together. And if you stay in this city, you could have another job that you also love, although not quite as much as the other. So it's not like you're choosing between something that's clearly not going to work and something that could work, but it's not. In that case, there's no, if you specify the case correctly enough, there's no right answer in the sense of already existing out there in in the world answer that's the correct one for you, and you have to find it. You have to decide. There are two lives open to you, both of which lives are plausible lives, and you just pick between them. And you have to be rational, and what being rational and paying for it in this context means is really thinking about what does this whole life look like, and making sure that you're not just taking one element to you that's really salient and evading or blocking out or just not noticing all the rest of it and stupidly jumping into something, whichever side you go to. But if you're really doing everything you can to and everything that's reasonable to do, to think what would this whole life look like, what am I really choosing between, and you can give yourself at least reasonable accounts of why you want each of the things, and it's just, I've always liked these two things and now I have to pick, then you just have to pick. Okay. And when you make that choice, you become a different person than you would have made if you made the other choice. Actually, I could recommend a good video on this by a philosopher who teaches at Rutgers, not an objectivist at all, but I think she's insightful on this topic. There's a video by Ruth Chang. It's a TED Talk on YouTube called something like Making Hard Choices. And I think what she says is really right.
Okay, thanks.
Hello. So my question is a philosophical one. How does one establish a posteriori so that such things as mind-independent values are established?
How does one establish?
Yeah. How does one establish?
The sentence didn't quite scan.
How does one establish a posteriori that there are such things as mind-independent values?
That there are such things as mind-independent values.
Correct.
So this is a little technical, and I don't want to say too much about what these terms like a posteriori mean because there are other people and they might not care. But I'll say this much. The whole trick to moral philosophy, it's not a trick, the whole essence of moral philosophy, and really most philosophy, is thinking about where the relevant concepts come from. So what you want to do is think about where does the concept value come from? How does it arise? What are the facts that give rise to it? And then with that in mind, what does that mean about what things would count as values? And if you think about what the roots of the concept value and what the origins of it are, then you see why we need such a concept and then what phenomenon in the world that concept is referring to. And that gives you a sense of what the standards for values have to be. And Ayn Rand certainly written on this, and I've written on this. And so I mentioned the essay, The Objectivist Ethics, and in a companion, and the chapter on the good in Leonard Peikoff's Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, and chapters 3, 5, and 6 in a companion to Ayn Rand are all about this question. So, but it's seeming to me like you have a more specific question having to do with the role of reason versus the senses, and why don't we talk about that after outside?
All right.
Because this guy doesn't care about reason versus the senses. I could tell. Oh, that's Zach. He probably does. But anyway, or actually, I have to go to this side first.
Why do you think ethical second-handedness has become so pervasive in our society? Why do you think the idea of not living for yourself and living to some preconceived values is more powerful than doing what you want to do?
I didn't hear the beginning of the question. Could you say again?
Why do you think ethical second-handedness, almost like a Peter Keating, has become so much more popular and more powerful than living for yourself like Howard Rourke does?
Why does Peter Keatingism, so to speak, have become more popular than being like Howard Rourke?
Exactly.
It's easier.
It's easier?
It is easier. It's not. It's one. I don't know that it has become suggests that there was a time at which it wasn't. Like most people were Rourkes, and then we caught this disease of Keatingism. I don't think that. I think it was always that way. It's difficult. The default is just to be a bump on a log and let things happen to you. And this is, again, the point of free will. Free will is a kind of assertion. It's something you have to do. And the default is always not doing things. The default position is always just letting things happen to you. And most people aren't, total Peter Keatings, but they don't do as much of this as they can. So one part of it is that the default is always not doing rather than doing. And so you have to rise to the occasion. The second is that to do it really well and to do it in a way that's consistent over time and that lets you figure out how to achieve values, you need a moral code. And moral codes take time to develop. Someone has to discover them. They're not obvious from when we just, crawled out of or evolved from whatever thing we were, came before us. So we had to figure out human beings had to figure out how to plan long range, think long range. And their first attempts at doing it, had some good ideas kind of mixed in them, but a lot of bad too. And were interpreted as like rules that people had to follow. That's what religion basically is. And people got kind of stuck there, in part because they didn't want to do the extra work. So now we have a radical philosophy that can help us do a lot better. So 3 parts. Default is always not doing it. Part 2, to do it well and sustain it over time, you really need to learn how to do it. And so you need philosophy to really reliably sustain it over time, for a whole culture anyway. And only the first philosophies aren't that good, and only now, I think, do we have one that really consistently explains how to do it. It's not like it was impossible to do before, but it's a real aid.
Thank you.
Zach?
Hello. So just as a basketball player being tall naturally is better at basketball than like other things, do you think people have a like mental, spiritual, personality nature that they have inherently, and how do you go about achieving clarity on what that is for you?
Well, I don't think it matters. So by the time we're old enough to start, thinking about what we want explicitly and making decisions, we have a whole lot of traits that we've developed already. Sets of preferences, kind of stylistic differences. Some people are, louder and quieter, or more or less aggressive, or, more or less prone towards being anxious. I don't mean in a pathological way, but I just mean, more comfortable with different things and so forth. There are all these kinds of differences between people. What factors into those differences? Here's one option. We're all born exactly alike in all these respects. And every difference between us at all is totally an issue of what's happened to us and what choices we made way back before we can remember. Maybe that's true. I suspect it's not. But it's much closer to true, I think we can tell, than we're all born with the personalities we're going to have as adults, and they just have to take time to flower. I think what's actually true is there are some kind of probably innate differences in our tendencies or capacities that are of the things like some people more easily experience anger than others, or it's experienced more intensely, and other people are more prone to alert, not alertness to focus, but like if they hear a noise, they'll are more triggerable in that respect. But whatever those differences are, and then for each one of them, there are different ways to develop a personality on top of that. But that's a really scientific question that you have to do by longitudinal studies of infants or something and twin studies. It's like a really difficult scientific question to parse out which things are like that and which things are through early experiences. And from a moral perspective, it doesn't matter. So you have the personality and traits you have. Some of them you can change. Some of them you can't. We don't even know totally which ones, but we know at least a lot about that. And many of them are neither good nor bad, but just, factors that can go into deciding what to do with your life. And so we know enough to make a good life for ourselves. Now, we don't know enough with some, like mental illnesses and some things we just don't know. And it's sad, and psychology is working on it and so forth. But I don't think for planning your life you have to know if, your preference for one kind of activity or another, or piano for cello or something, is due to your DNA or your early experiences or what. All right, we're out of time.